Hello and welcome to this brief video to help review material from Unit 4, Nationalism, Sectionalism in the Age of Jackson. So remember that this time period is very important in American history for several reasons, one of which being the end of the War of 1812. The War of 1812 can be considered a second war for independence, and while that has a lot of significance in and of itself, it's also important as a turning point in American history for economic reasons as well as political and social reasons. It begins a period of the era of good feelings. Remember that 8-year period of the era of good feelings was a period of a one-party system. It also led to a sense of nationalism and pride in America, and Americans started to think of themselves more so as Americans now instead of just members of their states. That period, of course, concludes with the election of 1824 and the famous corrupt bargain where John Quincy Adams is elected by the House over Andrew Jackson. That marks a new period of sectionalism, but also changing politics. The biggest significant point about changing politics in this era is universal white male suffrage, that states are finally granting the right to vote to all white men regardless of property. And that change marks a dramatic change not only in politics but also in society. Americans become more democratic. Americans take a more active role in politics. Americans start to move out westward with this fury of democracy and emphasis on the common man. And of course, Andrew Jackson comes to symbolize this. So what we'll do in this review is go through the major bullets for this part of the study guide, and I'll access a few other resources available to you. So I'll begin by directing you to the unit folders in Schoology. Remember that everything that we have used so far in this course is archived here. I go to the Unit 4 folder. Here are the various resources that you can access to review. I'd like to actually begin by reviewing the effects of the War of 1812. And I will attempt to write on this. So if we think about the effects of the War of 1812, obviously we have the immediate effects of the Treaty of Ghent. There is no exchange of territory in the Treaty of Ghent. This is terrible handwriting. So no exchange of territory, so nothing is gained and nothing is lost. But remember, in addition to the shared fishing rights and all of those agreements, there's also this burgeoning sense of nationalism. Things that helped to contribute to this would be Andrew Jackson's victory over the British at New Orleans, technically after the war was over. Also, another result is we have to think about Native Americans. Native Americans are defeated out in the West. And so with the defeat of Indian confederacies, we'll see a dramatic growth in westward expansion. And this is evidenced by many of the new states that will be admitted after this time period. Indiana, Illinois, Arkansas, and of course in 1820, Missouri, which brings about the famous Missouri Compromise. Also, this is the end of the Federalist Party. If you remember from the War of 1812, Federalists opposed the war and held the Hartford Convention. I still cannot write on this. And so this, of course, led to that era of good feelings, and that would spell ear. I would do this here. The era of good feelings, where we had a brief one-party system. And of course, that will contribute to this age of nationalism as well. There's also another effect. As we think economically and the long-term effects for the nation, there is an increase in manufacturing. This is because the years of embargo and war blockaded America from the products of Europe. And so Americans were forced to grow these things at home. Now, with this growth of manufacturing, obviously we have the rise of the American Industrial Revolution. So we'll put here rise of industry. And with the rise of industry and a desire to protect American manufacturers, we'll also see the increase of protective tariffs. Remember, rising protective tariffs then creates a sectional conflict between the North and the South because tariffs would benefit the North while harming the economies of the South. And that led to dramatic events like the Nullification Crisis. You definitely should review the Nullification Crisis, where South Carolina nullifies the tariff, then threatens to secede. Jackson threatens, of course, to send troops into South Carolina to enforce the federal law. And this is eventually resolved through the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which gradually reduced tariffs. However, by compromising on an issue like nullification and secession, we leave these questions unanswered until the Civil War. So even though we were effectively able to reduce sectional tensions through the Nullification Crisis or even through the Missouri Compromise, in this time period, eventually we won't be able to compromise on these major issues. So already we're looking at the immediate effects of the War of 1812, and we can see the long-term significance of these effects. Westward expansion, more states are admitted, but then of course the question of whether these states will be free or slave, made famous by the Missouri Compromise. The end of the Federalist Party and an era of good feelings, but we know that's not going to last because in 8 years there will be the famous corrupt bargain of 1824 and the splitting off of political parties, Democrats and then eventually Whigs. And of course the rise of industry. While that helps grow the economy of the North, it will lead to a debate on tariffs. It also is going to lead to a stratification of the North and the South economically. The North becomes more industrial, but the South remains rigidly agricultural because of cotton. The importance of the cotton gin cannot be overstated here. With the rise of the cotton gin and the rise of textile manufacturing in the North, we now have two economies that are dependent on one another, that link being cotton, but also becoming very, very different. And those differences are going to be exacerbated in this time period and eventually will be a contributing factor to the Civil War. So if we continue looking at our study guide then, I believe we've done a pretty good job addressing these items here. We certainly want to discuss Clay's American system and make sure that you review the components of Clay's American system. A new national bank, protective tariffs, which we've already discussed, and internal improvements. As Americans are moving out to the West, it seems necessary to construct more roads and canals, and Henry Clay and other future Whigs see the federal government as holding that role. Of course, Democrats, people from the Jeffersonian legacy and later supporters of Andrew Jackson, believe that the federal government has no business doing these types of federal projects, or these road projects and canal projects. Instead, those should be done by the states. But why is this necessary? Clay wants to see the growth of economic self-sufficiency. He wants to see the nation grow economically self-sufficient, not be dependent on foreign economies, and of course to increase trade. And having a system of roads and canals, having protective tariffs, and having a national bank that helps to organize the American economy makes this possible. It's also important to review major events of the Monroe years. The Panic of 1819 was caused by over-speculation of frontier lands. In McCulloch v. Maryland, the Supreme Court strengthened the role of the federal government over the states and the economies, and also, of course, declared that the Bank of the United States was constitutional. That's something that Andrew Jackson will have something to say about. So it is important to also review the Marshall Court decisions and how, in this period of growing states' rights and growing democracy, the Supreme Court under John Marshall did try to buttress the rights of the states for a stronger federal government. We also see some initial land expansion, and we'll review that momentarily. So here is the picture of a map in the classroom that I took a few months back. And I'll use this just to review some of the major areas of westward expansion. And so if we start for this time period, remember we said that Americans are spreading out west. Grab the pen here. So after the War of 1812, Americans are moving this way. And of course, roads and canals are going to help to connect us. In this region, of course, we see westward expansion because of cotton. With roads and canals and this transportation revolution, as well as new inventions in the north, so we have new inventions here which allow the growth of industry. And then, of course, new inventions out here, like the steel plow and the mechanical reaper, are going to help grow agriculture. This, of course, is the market revolution. So in this time period, and of course after effect of the War of 1812, we have a market revolution where each economy can become independent. Each economy can be independent, well, and also dependent. Because now with good roads and canals that link these economies together, each region can focus on specialization. They can focus on one particular economic activity and buy and sell everything else from other regions. So the Northwest region will focus on agricultural production and meat production. The Northeast will focus on new factories made possible through Samuel Slater's factory, the textile loom, and of course growing immigration from Ireland and Germany, and of course with the cotton gin in the South, the expansion of cotton and also the expansion of slavery. So don't forget to also review that implication with the internal slave trade. We also have additional territories acquired. Jackson led his famous raid into Florida, which led to the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819 and the purchase of Florida. We also have the Missouri Compromise, and we just discussed the issue with the admission of Missouri. So to review that, the Missouri Compromise brought in Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and then drew the line where states north of the line would be free and south of the line would be slave. This is also a period where Americans are being invited to Texas. And if we review that, remember that in 1836, Texas won its independence from Mexico, requested to be annexed as a state, but annexation was denied because of the slavery debate. Texas won't be annexed until 1845. So continuing on with our review guide, it will be important to review the election of 1824. Remember, in this election, Andrew Jackson gained more electoral votes and more popular votes than any other candidate. And we're also starting to see states count popular votes as more states are granting the right to vote to all men regardless of property. However, because he did not have a majority in the Electoral College, it goes to the House, and the House chooses John Quincy Adams. This, of course, begins the separation of Democratic Republicans, the only party left standing after the War of 1812, into National Republicans and Democrats. Those National Republicans later renamed themselves the Whigs. By the time Jackson is finally elected in 1828, it is considered a revolution because more Americans are voting than ever before. By this point, most states have eliminated property requirements for voting. So to look at the Jackson era a little bit better, I've pulled up these board notes that are in the Unit 4 folder. So these are the important themes of the Jackson presidency to review, and if you're looking at the midterm review guide, many of them are included here. The main crises of the Jackson years: Indian removal, which of course Jackson believed that that was supportive of the common man because it was common white men who were moving into the South to grow cotton. The Nullification Crisis, which of course is extremely important to review, and we've already mentioned that, as well as the Bank War. Jackson vetoes the bank, is reelected, and then decides to remove federal deposits from the bank because he fears that the bank will be manipulated. By taking the money out of the bank and putting it in state pet banks, it did eventually cause the Panic of 1837. So I hope this was a helpful review, and I'll post more reviews later. Take care.